everybody, and welcome to a very special board gaming video. This particular one, I won't be talking about multiple games, but rather I'm going to be talking about my absolute favorite game of all time, which I have mentioned several times throughout my videos, and the game itself is Cosmic Encounter. Now, I haven't really delved into pretty much any game that I've really discussed as far as like how it works and all that kind of stuff. So I figured what better way than my absolute favorite game of all time. The idea behind Cosmic Encounter is each person picks an alien power that breaks different rules. The major idea behind the game is that you're negotiating with the other players. You're trying to get them on your side, you're trying to beat the other people, and essentially, typically it comes down to card values. And it's sort of like war with a deck of cards, just the really basic who wins type of thing. But in this case, the alien powers are what really change the rules, okay? So this particular game has gone through many iterations. It started off with Eon Publishing in, I want to say, the mid-70s, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not quite certain, though. But then it went to Mayfair Publishing, and then it went to Avalon Hill, and last but certainly not least, Fantasy Flight. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be discussing a little bit about the game mechanics, but mostly I'm going to be talking down or counting down my top 10 favorite powers from the base game of Fantasy Flight that drastically change how you play the game, right? So to get started, I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the mechanics and how the game works. So to start off with, each player chooses a color. There are multiple colors that you can play. In the box here, I've actually got 3 of the expansions, but basically each player picks a color. So in this case, we've got blue, and you can see you've got little blue ships. So the idea is that each player has a system of 5 planets, and you start off with 4 people on each planet. And then essentially the way it works is you pick who goes first, and then you draw to attack somebody. All right, there's something called the Destiny deck, and if somebody else's color comes up, you go and you attack them. Easy enough, right? And essentially you have a hand of cards. Let me dig out the cards here. So you can see in the little bag there it says attack 30. That's an example of an attack card. And the whole point is just that whoever ends up having the highest total more often than not simply wins, right? You can have alliances, you can have other players come and they add to your total, all sorts of stuff like that. That is on the most basic level what's going on. But what throws a wrench into the entire thing are the alien powers, right? The idea behind the game is that if you gain 5 what are called foreign colonies, that is colonies on other players' planets, essentially if you are attacking them and you win, you land your ships on their planet, and then you have a foreign colony. After you get 5, you win the game. All right? So the alien powers are what really change up how the game works, and they break a bunch of the rules to certain extents. All right, different powers do different things and all that kind of stuff. One important thing to mention with the Fantasy Flight, this is what it looks like. This is called the warp. Okay, the warp is where all of the ships go after they die. Okay, you can get ships out of here, but essentially it's kind of like think of it kind of like purgatory, where they're sort of stuck in limbo. They can't really get out unless you make them come out. All right, so if you lose, then your ships go here and you can no longer utilize them, but there are certain things that break this. All right, so the idea is that you have to balance between using enough ships to where you can take over your opponent, but at the same time, you want to be very careful because you can very quickly lose a lot of ships, and it's very unpleasant. So again, this is working from the Fantasy Flight version of this game, and what I'm going to be doing is, like I said, counting down my top 10 personal powers that really, they don't break the game, but they drastically change how you play, like how you're going to pick your card, the sort of mind games and the meta game that you're playing with the other players. Okay, so keep in mind that this is just with the base game itself. This is not using any of the expansion characters, just with the base. And if you're familiar with the game at all in terms of the previous iterations, the Mayfair or the Avalon Hill or the Eon, the very first one, then you'll probably recognize some of these powers and what they can do. Okay, so we're going to just go right on ahead and get started with the top 10 list. So I've got here in my hands my 10 list, okay? So this is going to be going essentially from what I think is the mildest form of changing the gameplay to the most drastic, okay? And again, this is all very much my opinion, but we're going to go on ahead and get started with my number 10, which is the machine, okay? The idea behind the machine is that it breaks the basic rule that during your turn you can only have 2 encounters. Ordinarily, essentially what you do is you go, you attack somebody, if you win, you can go again. With the machine, you can go constantly. The only thing that stops you is running out of cards. One of the most difficult games that I had playing this, it was an older version, but it was the same principle, is the machine combined with the philanthropist. The philanthropist is able to give cards to other players. So the last thing that you want is a machine philanthropist alliance, because that means that the machine can constantly get more attack cards and keep going and going and going no matter what, until they lose, basically. Since I'm on the subject of the machine here, you may notice that at the very top you can see the little red lights. For the Fantasy Flight version, you have green, yellow, and red, and it essentially indicates how difficult the power is to sort of implement and make a really strategic decisions. So with the machine, it's a very difficult one, simply because it is the machine and it is easy to sort of try to overdo this. But at the same time, it does really drastically change what you're capable of, because if you get a really good hand of cards, and you can just keep going and essentially win on your first turn. So everybody else sort of has to ally against you to just try to stop you, right? Major changes to this. Not so major as some of the other ones, but still some pretty substantial ones. At number 9, I have an old favorite of a power, which is the Filch. Right? The Filch is actually one of the abilities that was changed for the Fantasy Flight version, in that the card associated with it had both the classic and a new version. But essentially the idea behind the Filch is what's called the power of theft. And the idea is that after you have an encounter with the Filch, they can take your card. So let's say that the Filch plays an 8 and you play a 20. I mean, you win, probably more than likely, but regardless of whether the Filch wins or loses, they can take your card. So if you're going against the Filch, then you always want to try to lowball it just a little bit. Again, it really affects how you as an opponent will play. Okay, it can really change that aspect, and you always want to go with a slightly lower card, but obviously at the same time you still want to win. So it's a very, very difficult balance. And in addition, one thing I forgot to mention is 2 unique cards called a Negotiate and a Morph. The Negotiate card essentially means we surrender. And if you do that and your opponent plays a number card, then they essentially steamroll you and you get to take cards from them. But you still lose. Okay? The Morph card does pretty much what it sounds like. You play the Morph card and it changes whatever your card is to whatever your opponent played. So essentially, if you have more ships, it's most likely that you're going to win with a Morph. Right? So for the Filch, you maybe want to play a Negotiate card, but you never really want to play a Morph, because you don't want to give them that power. There's only one Morph in the entire beginning deck. Okay? So Filch, definitely a very unpleasant character to have to deal with, and that's why it is my number 9. At number 8, I have a really, really nasty power that is very unpleasant in a very specific way. The power is the Shadow. So the text on the card says you have the power to execute. This is a very, very unpleasant power, and it changes essentially the way that you maintain colonies. because the idea behind the shadow is that on every player's turn, when they draw the destiny that determines who they're going to attack, the shadow essentially says, okay, from that player, I take that ship and put it in the warp. That's it. You can't, well, you can always stop it, but it takes a very special card to stop this, and it's called a Cosmic Zap, which I'll get into in a little bit. But the whole point is that typically in a game of Cosmic Encounter, what you want to do is you want your colonies, your foreign colonies, to be fairly sparsely occupied. You don't want to have 4 ships, which is the maximum on them, because it means that your home system is pretty defenseless. The problem is with the Shadow, you always have to have a fairly decent number. You always want at least 2. Because the problem is with the Shadow, they pick where the ship comes from. If you have a colony, a foreign colony that only has 1 ship, they can take that away and put it in the warp, and now you are down a foreign colony. Very, very, very unpleasant, and extremely powerful if used in just the right way. And the problem is, at the beginning of every single player's turn, they get to use this power. But it is due to the destiny that they get to pick who it is, or the destiny picks who it is, rather, unless it's a wild card, and then Shadow gets to pick where it comes from. So this can be extremely unpleasant, especially if you combine it with several of the other powers that I'm going to be talking about a little later on. Okay? Really not fun. A very nasty power that can eliminate foreign colonies in a snap. Very, very bad. Very dangerous. The Shadow. At number 7, I have a sort of species that we are all very, very familiar with. It is the human, the humble human. In this case, the not-so-humble human. The human actually has a very simple power. It says you have the power of humanity, which I don't really understand. But the idea behind it is that whether you are attacking, defending, or allying with whichever side, you always just add +4. That's it. You just add it. That's your power. That's what you do. And the problem with this is that it's similar to a permanent reinforcement card. If you're not familiar with it, a reinforcement card is a special type of card that you play after the cards are revealed. The numerical or the negotiate cards are revealed. You say, no, we have +8. That's a really high one, but it is in there. But you have like a +2 or a +3. And it can tilt the balance with what's going on. The human, therefore, is extremely powerful, because it just grants +4 all the time. So if you remember the Filch, which takes the card, you can go with playing a lower card against the Filch because you always have a +4, no matter what. In addition, the special card, the Cosmic Zap, which essentially eliminates a player power, simply makes the human win. If you Cosmic Zap the human, they win the encounter no matter what. Except for 1 power that's also in the stack, but later on. So the human is something that you really have to be very careful with, because you always have to highball whatever you're doing. You always have to go higher than you might expect, and you can't get rid of it, because if you Cosmic Zap them, then they just win, unless you have some other way of taking care of the fact that they just won. Okay? Very, very, not really annoying, but definitely something that makes you think about how you're going to attack them, okay, or defend against them, and essentially says you really got to play as high as you possibly can, because otherwise you're probably going to be in trouble from the human. So that's why it is my number 7. At number 6, I have a very, very interesting red power, very difficult power to play, and it is the Masochist. The Masochist has a very, very interesting win condition where if they lose all of their ships, they win. That's it. If all of their ships are in the warp or otherwise removed from the game, they win, regardless. And the power, the little flavor text, is simply you have the power to hurt yourself, which is masochism. Okay? It means that you enjoy being hurt, basically. And the problem with the Masochist is that you have to be very careful about where you attack them. Because more often than not, they will constantly be sending 4 ships after people because they really don't care if they're losing ships. The problem is they can still win with 5 foreign colonies, but if ever they have, I think it actually is at the start of the turn, and yeah, at the start of any player's phase, if you have lost all your ships, then you win. And the thing is that this is really countered by something like Mobius Tubes, which is a special card that releases all the ships from the warp. Then you negate this power, at least to a certain extent. But part of the problem is, again, if they keep losing, and more importantly, if they are trying to deliberately lose, it can make it that much more difficult. Because in this game, it's fairly simple to throw an encounter and to purposely lose. Okay? And that means that as an opposing player, do you really want to let them lose? I mean, obviously you want to win regardless, but at the same time, you might want to try to throw it if they're really close to having every single one of their ships in the warp. But at the same time, the Masochist can't really go for both victory types. It's very difficult for them to go for a 5 foreign colony victory and losing all their ships at the same time. They kind of have to pick one or the other, which is one of the advantages of going against them, but at the same time, it can be very difficult because they might start by going for all the colonies, and then if they just start losing, it's just like, okay, fine, I'm just going to purposely lose, whatever, no worries. So it can be very difficult to deal with, but certainly not as hard as some of the other ones, but certainly something to keep an eye out for. So that is why the Masochist is my number 6. At number 5 is a very, very unique power that is related to alliances. And this particular one punishes those that don't ally with you. The power itself is Grudge. This is the first of several powers throughout the expansions in the first game that actually had its own special tokens. And the idea is that if you invite somebody to ally with you and they refuse, they get a Grudge token. And then if you lose, they are punished very severely, where they will lose 4 ships, which is crazy. Considering that you start off with 20 and you lose 4 just for not allying with this guy is pretty ridiculous. But at the same time, if you win and somebody didn't ally with you, I believe they just lose 1 instead. Yes, just 1. Now, it is kind of nice because for this particular power, it's the player gets to choose where they come from. So for the opposing players, it's a little bit easier than, say, the Shadow, where you actually pick where they come from. But this is still a very, very difficult power to deal with, especially if they're on the defense, because you really want to get colonies, and having to defend somebody can basically means that you can get ships back, you can get new cards, but you're not really progressing towards the win condition directly, which can kind of suck. And in addition, heaven forbid, you're playing the Grudge against the Masochist, and then the Masochist is just like, oh no, I don't want to ally with you, by the way, I hope you lose, because then I lose 4 ships. Oh, boo-hoo. And in addition, it can be even worse, because the Masochist can ally with the defense, send 4 ships, and then if the defense wins, then the Grudge is like, oh, if the Grudge wins, then they lose the 4 ships because they were on the defense, and then plus another 1, so a total of 5. Very unpleasant. Regardless, they would lose a lot of ships. Really bad. So the Grudge is very, very difficult, especially with fewer players, because part of the problem is with this game, I think the really good sweet spot is 4. With the first part of the game, you can play with 3 to 5, and then the expansions add up to 8 players, which is ludicrous if you ask me. It's an insane game with 8 players. But with the Grudge, like when you have so few players, then I mean, especially if you're only playing with 3 people, they can only ally with one of the other 2. And the problem is they either always ally with the Grudge or they have to not, and it can be very unpleasant, and that's why, particularly in small groups, Grudge is a very, very nasty thing, but also extremely powerful if you know how to use it. If you know what you're doing and you know how to play Grudge, then you can lay on some very, very serious hurt against all of your opponents. So that is why Grudge is my number 5. At number 4, I actually have one of the easier cards to play, or one of the easier powers to play, but one that frustrates all players pretty much to no end. The Sorcerer. The Sorcerer's ability is the power of magic, and the idea is that you play the cards face down on the table. After everything is done, you have the alliances and all that stuff, and then the Sorcerer switches the cards. It is unbelievably frustrating to have to deal with the Sorcerer. And the thing is that it is a green power. It's a very easy power to play because you can easily, as the Sorcerer, just play a Negotiate and then switch the cards around. And now your opponent's playing a Negotiate, right? But part of the thing is that there are so many interactions that this power can be, or that this power can have. And it's pretty unbelievable that there's a lot of different things. Like imagine with the Filch. The Filch can potentially play a card that they want to keep, and then the Sorcerer has to think, okay, do I really want to switch it because they just want to keep that card? Even though they're probably going to lose, they'll be able to use it again, all that kind of stuff. But the Sorcerer is probably the most mind-bending power that you can play against, because you always have to ask, are they going to switch my card? Are they going to switch my card with their card? I don't know. And the problem is, if they do, then you could be in big trouble. If you can manage to predict whether or not they will, then obviously you can play that low card, have them swap it. Okay? Very, very frustrating to play against. Relatively simple to play as, simply because you know what you played, so you know what your opponent is going to be getting. And you can basically just hope that they didn't play a Negotiate or whatever. But an extremely powerful card that can substantially change how you're playing, what you're playing, all of that kind of stuff. Very, very unpleasant, very difficult to deal with, but a really fun power to have at the table. So that is why the Sorcerer is my number 4. At number 3, I have what is probably by far one of the most frustrating powers to have to deal with in the entire game, and it is Antimatter. Antimatter is interesting because it's similar to another power that I still haven't talked about, but still substantially different. With this, the idea is that the lower total wins. And on top of that, if you are playing as Antimatter, instead of having your ships and your allies' ships add to your total, they get subtracted. So in other words, your opponent, let's say you both play 15s, just to keep it simple, and they have 4 ships and you have 4 ships. So your 4 ships subtract from your 15 to give you 11, and their 4 ships add to them to give them 19. This is a very, very difficult power to play against, because not only do you have to keep really, really low cards and they actually help you, but if you end up playing the same card, or if they play a morph, they win. Simply because the Antimatter's power is they decrease rather than increase when they have ships on their side. This is the type of thing that can really screw everything up. I mean, you can have Antimatter going against the Sorcerer, for example, which I just talked about. It can make everything ridiculously crazy. Just ludicrous, right? Not to mention Antimatter going after the human. If you remember, the human just automatically adds 4 no matter what. So already, not only do the ships add, but the human is also in the wrong because they have an additional 4. So they have their ships plus the 4, which means that Antimatter is at least 5 up from the very beginning. So it becomes extremely difficult to deal with, but at the same time, if Antimatter gets stuck with a whole bunch of really high cards, then their power isn't necessarily negated, but it makes it much more difficult to be dealt with. And again, there are a lot of interactions within and amongst these, and the last card I'm going to be talking about really just trumps everything as far as swapping the encounter cards, thinking about how you're going to play, what you're going to play, who you're going to invite, all of that kind of stuff. And it just makes everything that much more ridiculous. But regardless, Antimatter, definitely worthy of being one of the ones that changes drastically how you play this game, what card you're going to play, who you're going to invite, how you're going to send your number of ships, all of that kind of stuff. Antimatter, definitely a deserving number 3. At number 2, I have a power that actually completely negates the ability of several other powers in the game, in the base game as well as some of the expansions. It is an extremely frustrating power that has been around for a very long time, but at the same time is extremely difficult to play both as and against. The power is the Void. The Void is extremely unpleasant because instead of ships going to the warp, where they just sit there and wait to be released from the warp, they are removed from the game entirely. After they're gone, they are completely gone. Some of the other powers that aren't on the list that are very, very important and that are also frustrating in their own right are completely negated by the Void. The first one is Zombie. The idea behind Zombie is that your ships never go to the warp because they're zombies, they don't die. The problem is, with the Void, ships don't go to the warp at all. They just get removed. So Zombie's power is completely eliminated by the Void because the ships aren't going to the warp, so you can't stop them. They are just completely removed altogether. The second major one is the alien power known as the Warpish, which is a really nasty power that probably would have been 11 or 12 on this list if I had gone farther. But the idea behind that is for all of the ships in the warp, including their own, they add that to their side's total. You can imagine if you've got Warpish plus something like the Masochist that is actively trying to lose ships, the Warpish can become extremely powerful extremely quickly. The problem is, with the Void, there isn't a warp. There's nothing there. They are simply gone from existence. The Void is a very, very, very nasty power, and it causes many players, most players, to really scale back on attacks. They don't want to keep sending 4 ships every single time, because if you lose, those things are gone permanently. And the problem is, again, you have a lot of interesting interactions with some of the powers, even a lot of the ones I talked about. The human simply adding 4, or worse yet, the human is losing, Cosmic Zap themselves, oh no, I got Cosmic Zapped, I win, you leave, right? The human always has that option, which is a very, very unpleasant thing to have to deal with, but the Void is probably one of the, if not the most dreaded card to see, right? One of the other ones that, again, is probably the other of 11 or 12 is the Virus. Virus, very, very annoying. Instead of adding the ships to the total, they multiply them. Oh, so bad. Nothing like seeing a 20 hit the table and 4 ships, so now you're dealing with 80 instead of 24. Very, very unpleasant. But the Void very effectively counters many powers, right? Anything that prevents ships from going to the warp. You've got something like, you've got the Observer, you've got the Healer, you've got, again, the Zombie, the Warpish is always good to have ships in the warp. The Masochist loves the Void, because with the Masochist, it's like, oh no, now I can't get my ships back, what a shame, it looks like I'm going to win. So that is part of why the Void is a red power. It is extremely difficult to play as, very difficult to sort of get the balance just right, but it can literally destroy certain powers and make them completely non-applicable anymore. They are worthless, they do nothing anymore. Void, very frustrating, drastically changes pretty much every aspect of the game, and a very worthy number 2. So, at long last, and certainly, last but absolutely not least, it's actually last but the highest, is what is probably the most dreaded power, or certainly the one that is most frustrating when you're dealing with multiple different power types that change things and alter the way things go. Right? This is a power that has been with Cosmic Encounter for a very long time, and it is still just as dreaded today as it was back then. The power is the Loser. The Loser is a very interesting power, because before you pick what card you're going to play, the Loser can shout upset or I declare an upset. And the idea behind the upset is the losing player wins. It is an important distinction from something like Antimatter, because with Antimatter it says the lowest total wins. This says the losing player wins. It's a slightly different thing, but still significant. So for example, if you play a negotiate card and your opponent plays an attack card, and you declared an upset, then you're just like, oh, well, looks like I win because I played a negotiate and I declared an upset. Not to mention all of the issues that you can have with something like, say, the Grudge, because the loser can virtually choose who wins, right? That's an exaggeration. They don't do that unless they have a negotiate card or whatever it happens to be. Then they can make them win, but this negates the human's ability of being Cosmic Zap. So say the loser, and a very unpleasant experience I might add, to have the loser, somebody else at the table, against the human, me, and essentially I'm winning because I have a lower total. And then they take out a Cosmic Zap and say, I Cosmic Zap your power, you win. Oh, but it's an upset, so I win. Oh, the loser. It can be so annoying having to deal with the loser. Not to mention against something like the Sorcerer, because then the Sorcerer can screw up the cards. Filch, not so much, but I mean, the Void certainly loves the loser, because then you can have all sorts of craziness. And not only that, but loser versus Antimatter, which is always an infamous combination, although a lot less difficult than it might seem. It actually almost negates the capability of Antimatter, because the whole point with Antimatter is that they're subtracting their numbers, and whoever has the lowest wins. Whereas with the loser, they want those nice big high numbers, because in an upset, the highest number wins, and Antimatter is at a huge disadvantage against an upset. Same thing, very recently I was playing a game. We were actually playing with 2 powers each, but it really didn't make that much of a difference. I was playing as Virus, and somebody else was playing as the loser. So the problem with Virus is that you have, again, you have that multiplication effect rather than an additive effect. So I'm in big trouble because I have relatively large cards, and I'm sending, part of the problem with the loser is that it's an optional power. They don't have to declare an upset, and it's after everything is set. It's after you have your set number of ships getting sent, alliances are set, all of that kind of stuff, right? And then the upset is declared. So I'm like, well, I better send at least 2, because that way I can almost negate the idea of being upset because I have some relatively low cards, but if I really need to, I've got higher cards so that I can deal with a non-upset. But it's very, very frustrating to have to deal with the loser because you don't know how many you should send. You don't know what you should be playing because you don't know what they're playing. Well, obviously you don't know what they're playing at any time, but it's so ridiculously easy for the loser to just be like, oh, I play a negotiate. And then there's not really much that you can do about it, unfortunately. And at the same time, with just the base set, so if you remember, I'm only talking about the base set here, part of the issue with many of these powers is that they become less of an issue from some of the other expansions, and not just because of new alien powers, but because of several new mechanics as well. One of the expansions to the Fantasy Flight added what's called the rewards deck, where if you successfully help somebody defend, you always either get to draw, take ships out of the warp or draw cards. With the reward deck, you can take cards from that reward deck, and it introduces a couple of very important things that were in previous iterations of the game. It introduces negative cards, and it also introduces kickers. So the negative cards are exactly that. For the base game, the lowest that they went was 0. You could have a 0/0 attack card. But then, with the addition of the rewards deck, I think it goes all the way down to -7 or maybe even -10. So that means that something like the loser or antimatter can be dealt with relatively easily with simply playing a negative card. And kickers do something very similar where they basically let you act as the virus for one turn, where you can multiply your attack card. Now, if you're really lucky, you also have the negative kickers. So again, the same thing, it can negate the ability of the antimatter and potentially the loser, right? So there are ways of dealing with these with the expansion, at least to a larger extent, but at the same time, you can still be in really big trouble when you're just in the base game, all right? But regardless, much hated over many, many decades of this game, very, very few ways to counter it, very difficult to counter, and just tough to play against in general. Not as tough to play as, which is always nice, but the loser definitely very deserving, and not at all ironically, in the #1 spot of the cosmic encounter powers that can most mess with gameplay. Well, that's it for me, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed my video where I talked about my personal favorite game, Cosmic Encounter, and my personal top 10 powers from the base game that drastically changed the way that the game can be played and the way that it's affected. So with that, thank you very much again. If you have anything that you want to say, whether you totally agree, totally disagree, sort of in the middle, feel free to put it in the comments. Any other powers, anything that changes gameplay, game experiences, whatever you want to put in, please feel free to put it in the comments. Let me know. Tell me what you think, all of that good stuff. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, and with that, I will see you next time.
Thank you again for watching my video on the top 10 Cosmic Encounter powers that can drastically change some of the game mechanics. If you have other powers you want to talk about, or anything about the game in general, please feel free to put it in the comments. If you want to see more of my videos, you can check out my channel, or quickly just look at some of the videos that I've linked at the top of the screen. If you want to see more of me, go ahead and hit the big giant subscribe button. You'll see more board games, video games, science, and all sorts of other stuff. With that, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.